Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the kickoff webinar in our series of 6 webinars on statewide comprehensive energy planning. This is hosted on behalf of the National Governors Association and our colleagues with the National Association of State Energy Officials. We're very excited to be kicking off this project and excited to be working with you all. So I'll go ahead and briefly introduce our panelists, then we'll give you an overview of the webinar so far, talk a little bit of background, then turn it over to our panelists to really walk us through where their states are on this. So first off, to introduce the panelists, we have Commissioner John Espandola from the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, formerly of Governor Dunleavy's office as well. We have Executive Director Curtis Thayer, the Alaska Energy Authority, the State Energy Office there. We have Director Nico Brady, Director of Agriculture and Environmental Affairs in the Office of Governor John Carney from Delaware. And then we have Deputy Director Preeti Tangaraj, Deputy Director of Climate Action and Green Economy at the Office of Governor Phil Murphy in New Jersey. He was our chair. I should get his name correct. Preeti, apologies for that. Thank you for joining the webinar. We're very excited about this work. I'm Chris Fletcher. I'm a senior policy analyst at the National Governors Association. We are the members association that represents all 55 state and territorial governors in the United States. We in particular support governors' energy advisors and other senior officials who work in and around the energy sphere. We do education, outreach, technical assistance, and convenings to support governors and their energy staff. And turn it over to my colleague, Sam Kramer, who represents NASEO.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here with you today. My name is Sam Kramer, and I'm a senior program director with the National Association of State Energy Officials. Like Chris, we are a membership association, but we represent the 56 state and territorial energy offices across the nation. So 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. And similar to NGA, we do a lot of work supporting the state energy offices and their priorities. We offer a lot of comprehensive technical assistance and support in helping the energy offices get from where they need to go, point A to point B, as well as supporting their priorities on Capitol Hill and in Washington, D.C. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, and we'd also like to thank our sponsors of this. So the webinar series is actually sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy. Several offices there on the NGA side, the Office of Electricity and the Grid Deployment Office are both funders of this endeavor. We really appreciate your support. I believe some folks will be able to join the call. And Sam, if I'm not mistaken, you guys have funders as well on this side?
That's correct. We would also like to thank the Office of State and Energy Community Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy for their support of this initiative.
Thanks, Sam, and thank you to our funders. We really appreciate the generous support that lets us get states together and really talk through state concerns and do peer sharing, since you guys are the experts, and it's great for us to be able to bring you together and have these conversations. So as this is the kickoff session, the first of 6 that we'll be hosting over the next 6 months, thought I'd go through some very brief housekeeping. Again, this is intended for state staff and state personnel. We're really interested in pulling you all together to let you learn from each other, to discuss best practices, and really talk through how different states have taken different approaches to statewide comprehensive energy planning. We will have time for questions at the end, so please put those in the chat. If you're an attendee or participant, you should be able to comment those directly, and at the end of each speaker's remarks, we'll be able to talk through some questions. This conversation is being recorded. We have a lot of folks in, especially the Pacific territories, that are time shifted. It's difficult to find time to get everybody on, so this will help us in follow-up conversations to send those out to other stakeholders who might be interested. So just a heads up that this is intended for a state-only audience, but it is being recorded. And finally, so a little bit of background. So we at NGA and our colleagues over at NASEO have been active in statewide comprehensive energy planning. Over the last few years, we've, on the NGA side, noticed a real uptick in states who are interested in kicking off this process. And so since there are a huge number of energy plans, it's probably worth going into what we mean by these kind of comprehensive statewide plans. When we talk about that, we're talking about the broadest, kind of highest level plans that are usually kicked off through an executive order, administrative action, or legislation. And that is where the state itself kind of gets together, thinks about its energy resources, looks at future planning, does modeling, analysis, stakeholder engagement, and really kind of sets policy goals and priorities in a forward-looking way. There are lots of plans that come out of that, but really the plans we're talking about here are this highest level, statewide, kind of wide lens view of that. A number of states, including all of the folks represented on this panel, are currently in the process at one point or another, and the goal of this webinar series is to really walk states through the entire process. So for this initial kickoff, we're talking about how you start this process. What are the concerns and motivations that a governor's office or a state energy office would think about as you kick off this process, how you choose to do that, and what motivates a state to take this on? Because these are very labor intensive and a lot of work, as everyone on the call I'm sure will attest. These are a big lift, but they're very valuable as a as a single kind of one-stop shop for what a state's energy goals and priorities are, and a really forward-looking way to articulate how state policy might shape the energy industry as we go forward. So go ahead and get started. So I think we'll kick it off to Commissioner Espandola to start us off, and then we'll go to Executive Director Thayer. Then we'll go in alphabetical order to Delaware and New Jersey. Just be really interested in kind of a high overview where your state is in the energy planning process. What did you observe kicking it off, and what tips or tricks would you have in mind for your state colleagues on the line? Kick it
Yeah,
off to you.
thank you, NGA and NASEO, for allowing me this opportunity to speak today. My name is John Espandola, Commissioner with the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. I've currently been in my role for the last 10 months, but prior to me serving in this capacity, I worked in the governor's office for 4.5 years, serving in several roles such as a policy advisor and a special assistant. Throughout my time working in the governor's office, all things energy was always a priority for Governor Dunleavy. Some of you may know that Alaska is an energy juggernaut with both traditional and renewable energy resources. And prior to serving as governor, he lived in rural Alaska for over 20 years. I grew up in rural New Mexico, and there's really no comparison between rural communities in the lower 48 and really they're more remote communities here in Alaska. Many of these communities are off of a road system, and they're only accessible by boat or plane. And a majority of these communities produce electricity using diesel power generation that is either barged in the summer or flown in by plane. So you can imagine how expensive the cost of energy is in many of these communities. This executive administration began in December of 2018, literally just days after a 7.1 earthquake hit South Central Alaska, which is the most populated area of the state. That following summer, the state experienced severe wildfires burning critical assets on the Kenai Peninsula that were related to a rail belt transmission grid. And then in 2020, we all know the global pandemic began. By 2022, the state was back on stable ground, so we dug in deep, focusing on energy planning. As I started looking at what other states were doing, I quickly realized that some states had an energy office in the executive branch of government. The state of Alaska's energy office is the Alaska Energy Authority, and although it is a state entity and housed within a branch of state government, it's an independent entity separate from the executive branch. So in September of 2022, through Administrative Order 340, the governor established the Office of Energy Innovation, which is housed in the governor's office. I then began working with NGA to help me track down energy planning efforts that were recently completed by other states. NGA did an exceptional job supporting me with this effort. I was quickly able to learn what other states were doing. Working with Curtis Thayer, we created the scope of work that set the path forward for the Alaska Energy Security Task Force. On February 23rd, through Administrative Order 344, the Alaska Energy Security Task Force was established. At that time, the task force consisted of 13 voting members and 5 ex officios. Approximately a month later, the governor revoked that administrative order and established Administrative Order 345, which added 2 more voting members. One of those included the lieutenant governor. The task force was comprised of key statewide leadership from the private sector, state and federal agency participation, our legislature, and Native community leadership. But why did we go with an administrative order? If the governor established the task force through executive order, it would have to be introduced on day 1 of the next legislative session. The legislature would then have 60 days to revoke the executive order. And if they did nothing, it would go into effect based on the effective date. If we propose legislation, we would again have to wait for the legislative session to begin. There would be no guarantee that the bill would get approved, and who knows what the bill would look like when it was done. So an administrative order was the most nimble approach to begin the process. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Turn it over to you, Director Thayer.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, appreciate inviting us here today, both John and I. A little bit about the Alaska Energy Authority itself. We are the statewide energy office. We do have a board of directors appointed by the governor, 7 board members. And we kind of have a unique mission in the sense we have owned assets. We own the state's largest hydro facility. We also own over 210 miles of transmission lines, which is actually 1/3 of the transmission lines in the state of Alaska. In addition to that, we have what we call a power cost equalization program, where it's a $1 billion endowment, which helps offset the cost in rural Alaska. For the cost of energy, we look at the price between Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau, and a weighted cost is roughly 20 cents a kilowatt, which establishes the floor up to 75 cents a kilowatt. And with that, though, it's important to note our most expensive village in rural Alaska is $1.75 a kilowatt. So our costs are very high in rural Alaska. And with that, we do a lot with rural energy. Primarily in rural Alaska, there's 197 communities that depend on diesel fuel and bulk fuel tanks as their energy. I know that some kind of question that and why it's the diesel fuel is the backbone. And that's because these communities are in an area of the state where there's no trees for biomass, or 3 months of darkness, where we don't have the sun, or we don't have the wind regime to do it for that, or we don't have the hydro ability. One thing to keep in mind with Alaska is we are 2.5 times the size of Texas, and our road system is the size of Connecticut. So when you put those two together, it's hard, as John had said, to get to these rural communities, and these are truly islanded microgrids. And one of the tasks that we wanted to look at is what we could do to introduce more renewables into these communities, not to replace what they had, but to offset the amount of diesel that they were using in the spring, summer, and fall, because they still need that firm power in the winter. We also do renewable energy and energy efficiency, all the different technologies here within our office. And we're, putting our foot a little bit in the water on micronuclear and looking at rural Alaska, and could that be a change for them in the years to come. We also do grants and loans. We have a grant program we call the Renewable Energy Fund, where we fund feasibility studies and conceptual designs in renewables. More than 80% of the funds go to rural Alaska. And we've spent $350 million the state has in that program. But with that, we've also displaced 85 million gallons of diesel fuel. So it is definitely having an effect in rural Alaska. And then I guess last but not least is energy planning. And working with John, working with the governor's office, AEA took the lead in putting together a task force. We started, as John said, in the spring, March, April time period. And on December 1st, we presented to the governor a final report. And I say final report, but it's really a living document. We met, we had 6 subcommittees because we are such a diverse state. We had subcommittees looking at the rail belt, and that's where we looked from Bradley Lake or Homer, where our hydro facility is, all the way to Fairbanks. Is 3/4 of Alaska's population is known as the rail belt. So we had a subcommittee focused on that. Obviously, coastal, we have more coastal than the United States combined. And so we wanted to kind of really look at the coastal side of it, because a lot of that we have the rainforest in Southeast, we have biomass, we have a lot of hydro opportunities. So they were unique in that. And then rural Alaska, again, just the uniqueness of rural Alaska, what's necessarily might work in Anchorage or some other part along the coast does not work in rural Alaska at 50 below, just doesn't do it. So we wanted a focus there. And then we wanted to look at what type of energy data we had as a state. We have AEA has data, the university has data, state departments have data. So we wanted to come up with a plan and have a focused subcommittee on how to capture that data and share that information. And then incentives and subsidies, especially with IIJ and IRA and all the different funding opportunities. We wanted to kind of see what are those opportunities available, not just, we all kind of look in our own silos of where funding is available, but not as a holistic approach. And so we focus a subcommittee there. And then also, obviously, what type of statutes and regulations need to be changed? Some obviously are simpler than others. But clearly, those were the 6 focused subcommittees. Our subcommittees met over 60 times in that window. We had 11 task force meetings. We met for over 150 hours, always with public engagement. And then a unique thing that we did, and I would really encourage states looking at this, we teamed up with the university and helped them kind of do is what we call Energy 101. We had 8 different energy symposiums. So the public and even our members on our task force can look, and if they wanted to learn about our power cost equalization program, or they want to know about micronuclear, or they want to know about hydro, there was a 2-hour series the university hosted on that is also available to anybody, still is today, so they can kind of get that 101. So we spent 16 hours of on-demand learning as part of our task force. And we've come up with 60 preliminary actions and considerations for the legislature. And I think when we walked away from the process, was there a silver bullet? No, there's no silver bullet. There's silver buckshot, as I call it. There's a lot you can do in different parts that definitely move the needle. And what's really interesting is looking at this legislative session and looking at the different bills that have come up, a lot based from the task force. I would probably say more than a dozen, almost 2 dozen, have some draw point back to the task force. And so we'll see where we end up with this legislative session. I was supposed to adjourn on May 15th that can kind of tie back into the task force. And I think from there, as the governor has told us, it's a living document. And so we'll probably go back and refine a few things and be ready for the next legislative session. But with that, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll go to Nico at Delaware.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you to the NGA team for having this session and including us as well. As far as we're concerned, in terms of even having the approach, the high level approach and sort of statewide approach, a lot of reasons. The main reason is that we're small. We're a state of 3 counties, and it typically integration and coordination across each of those counties just makes sense. And so to be able to tackle these kinds of significant challenges at a statewide level is the approach that makes the most sense for us. I think the beginnings of our energy journey certainly started in the early 2000s. I think we've had some ebbs and flows since then, but certainly a couple of executive orders closely tied to climate-related activity and goals. But as you know, coming closer to the present, focused on really firming up the energy plan. So we've done a lot legislatively and working closely with the General Assembly. And I think part of our focus has been on process. And so what we've established is the Governor's Energy Advisory Council, and that's our opportunity to incorporate thinkers, experts from a variety of sectors, both within our state agencies and outside of government as well, certainly representing industry and including the community and sort of our environmental advocacy groups as well. So through that group and being able to establish that group in the early 2000s, it's taken shape in different ways. And because it was legislatively mandated, we did experience, which I think might be helpful to some states to just hear that, we did experience lulls where because it was legislative, when there was a return in administration or a return in general in legislative sessions, you had to re-up the group. And so we at times needed to reappoint members and sort of rework the scope of the group and to some extent, but we're recently back on track. That group is tasked with formulating the recommendations that go into our energy plan, which is again a statewide plan, and it's meant to be a roadmap, and similarly in sort of aligning with our climate action plan. So I think for us, the focus has really been on process since the early 2000s and really closely tied with what we're doing on the climate front, and how that lends itself to energy. But I think what's worked well is making sure we're able to have everyone at the table, and we're able to sort of strike a balance, I guess, making sure we're hearing all of the perspectives. And then I think from that, being able to sort of start with the technical and sort of scientific basis of things, and I guess the industry sort of basis, sprinkling in the policy at the end, and trying to figure out sort of how to balance things with the consumer base, with the public, and sort of where we are and sort of what the environment will allow for, happens sort of at the end of being able to establish that really significant foundation at the technical side. So I think the Energy Advisory Council, which again, through legislation, a variety of different acts over the years, but a group nonetheless that has had a stable scope, has looked a little different, but has been pretty stable. And I think that's what's carried us through. I think in a lot of ways, we, as a state, beginning in the early 2000s to now, we at some point, at certain points, we were very forward, I think, in sort of perhaps front runners in some ways, related to energy. I think we've again had ebbs and flows, and now we're sort of in the middle of the hunt, at least related, tied to our region. But I think we're able to sort of take our time in some ways and be able to learn from our neighboring states. But I guess relying on that foundation and really returning back to that has been something through that Energy Advisory Council that we've been able to do. I think recently the work of our state energy office, which is in our department, state agency, Department of Natural Resources, all the while has continued. And I think, at some stages has gone into a silo, and it's the effort to bring it back out and to sort of integrate it into sort of other sectors. So I'll leave it there. I know we've got other questions, but thanks again.
Thank you, Nico. Appreciate that. And we'll go to Preeti to round out our opening remarks.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, NGA, for having us here today. A lot of what the other states are saying has really resonated with New Jersey's pursued over the past couple of years. I'll talk a little bit retrospectively about what we've been able to establish in the 2019 Energy Master Plan, and what came before and then what came after. New Jersey has had legislation on the books that does require the Board of Public Utilities, who serves in a dual role in New Jersey. They are both the Public Utility Commission and the State Energy Office in New Jersey. There was legislation that required the BPU to pull together what we refer to as the Energy Master Plan to define statewide energy initiatives, et cetera. It was definitely a little less proactive, 10-15 years ago compared to what we've been able to accomplish now, which is where the Murphy administration really kicked off more of the sector-specific clean energy planning for New Jersey. Governor Murphy signed Executive Order 28 back in 2018, which directed the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, in partnership with a lot of our other state agencies, to develop a statewide clean energy plan and shift away from energy production that contributed to climate change. And then that plan was released in 2020 to address strategies for the administration to reach 100% clean energy by 2050 at the time. So let me talk a little bit more about what that process and what the scope of that plan entailed. It really was a deep dive to comprehensively address New Jersey's energy system, which includes everything from generation to transportation to buildings, industry, et cetera, and of course their associated greenhouse gas emissions and other air pollutants. The way the plan was split up was really in two big parts. One was an integrated energy plan exercise that looked at what load growth would be by 2050, and what resources played a part in that. The second part was more of a narrative body that detailed some of the goals and targets and recommendations of the board for policy initiatives, regulatory reforms, and legislative reforms. And that's something that also threaded the needle with what was concurrently being written by the Department of Environmental Protection for an emissions reduction plan. So everything was really happening all at once, and came together and was aligned, thankfully. The way the narrative document was split up, it was split up across 7 main strategies. So I can run through that quickly. Number 1 was, how do we reduce energy consumption and emissions in the transportation sector? Number 2, how do we accelerate renewable energy and distributed energy resources? How do we maximize energy efficiency and conservation while reducing peak demand in New Jersey? How do we reduce energy consumption and emissions in buildings? How do we decarb and modernize the energy system in New Jersey and more broadly? And then the last 2 were really about, how do we support community energy planning and certain energy actions in underserved communities, as well as expanding the clean energy innovation economy and the green workforce to make sure we are fulfilling a lot of our policy goals. So that was the big trunk of what was in the narrative body. We undertook a pretty significant stakeholdering process where we worked closely with our utilities, with industry, with the environmental advocates, with environmental justice advocates. As you can imagine, there was a good amount of flack on the political side. The biggest question when I think states are pulling together these clean energy plans is, what does it cost for our ratepayers? So I think I'll save that answer for when you ask us about challenges, Chris.
Thank you, Preeti. And thank you all for the opening remarks. This is such a fascinating topic for a variety of reasons, but what kind of speaks to me most is just that, 55 states and territories, each state has its unique challenges and opportunities and resources. And so there is not a single way to do this type of comprehensive planning. It really is bespoke for each state, and each governor or state energy official, as the motivations that you have or how you kick off this process can really kind of have ramifications going forward. As John mentioned in his remarks, an administrative order was just more nimble than trying to pass legislation, which has its compromises and its own faults. And so it's a really fascinating subject to me. And so really just to get us started and to kick us off while the rest of the group starts to put questions in the chat is, what, if you could, at a top line, what was your state really hoping to get out of this energy planning process? As we mentioned, it's enormously labor intensive, but what was the kind of top line motivation when you were delegated this task from your principals? What were you kind of looking for? And I'll just kick that to the main panel and let you guys go.
I'll go first. So the governor charged this group with getting to 10 cents per kilowatt hour energy statewide. That was the underlying goal of the task force. As the work started, and Curtis can speak to this, without significant subsidies, that just isn't possible in a place like Alaska. But that was the initial driver of getting to 10 cent kilowatt hour energy so that we can be competitive in other economic sectors with the lower 48.
The motivation in New Jersey was to outline the state's strategic use, management, and the development of clean energy to make sure we hit 100% clean energy by 2050. Now we're undertaking an update to the plan, which is going to examine 100% clean energy by 2035, which is the new accelerated target in New Jersey, as well as address our interim and 2050 emissions reductions goals.
So for Delaware, our energy goals are closely aligned again with our climate related goals. So, being able to achieve net zero by 2050. as well as addressing using our energy strategies to better address some of the climate impacts, including the fact that we are the lowest lying state in the nation. And that's just something that is very prevalent and apparent. So being able to structure our energy strategy to be able to address that. But also, I think being cognizant of the value of industry and sort of what the implications are related to economic development. And I think to be able to strike, again, I think our use of the process has been acknowledging that and being able to strike a balance where we are able to achieve what's feasible without totally upsetting the system. So I think that's really been something that we've been sort of focused on.
And from Alaska's perspective, and John had mentioned 10-cent power was started to be the driver and continue to be the driver throughout the process. But I think for us, being such a large state and breaking down the task force, the rail belt issues are about clean energy standards, also transmission lines. We have very inadequate transmission lines, and before we want to introduce any type of renewables, we have to upgrade those transmission lines. And so that was one of the key came out of the rail belt. Completely different in rural Alaska when you start looking at those 197 rural communities and how they operate and what would help those communities. And even in a subset of those 197 communities. And then with the rural, hydro was a big player in that and looking at those opportunities. And so for our task force and the way that we had set it up among those 6 different subcommittees, but the regional ones really came back with different answers in the sense that clearly, one answer does not fit across all spectrums of the state. 3/4 of our population is on the rail belt, but their issues and their concerns are very different. But the way that, like, even the power cost equalization program is set up, looking at the floor being the rail belt and Juneau, our state capital, if we could lower that rail belt cost, there's more funding available in rural Alaska, just the way the statutes are written. So really for us, it was kind of eye-opening. If you move this lever, how this might affect this in a completely different part of the state. And so there's still, I still think there's a lot of work to be done. But after, like I said, after meeting for 150 hours and coming up with several hundred pages of recommendations, we decided to take a pause and get through the legislative session.
Chris, the one thing I would add is also, state curiosity in what will fulfill the full, long-term energy plan to maintain safe and reliable service to ratepayers, in addition to achieving some of the clean energy goals and affordability, of course. But for example, what does that 5% of clean firm look like for New Jersey, and how do we achieve that? What technologies does that entail? And also, I think a lot of these plans set the framework for a lot of, at the time, nascent industries. For example, we didn't have a offshore wind procurement goal back then, right? So it was definitely an opportunity to sustain those types of industries.
Yeah, thank you, Preeti. That's a great point and really a good segue into the first question we have. Please, in the audience, put whatever questions you have in the Q&A box. We'd be happy to pass those along to our panelists. So that's a great way to kind of look at, more broadly speaking, what impacts do these energy plans have and how do they connect with other planning processes, especially our colleagues in the state energy offices know that the IIJA has the SESP, the state energy security plans, there's integrated distribution system planning, integrated resource planning. So there's all these different versions of planning, and these comprehensive plans kind of sit on top of that or are sort of a wider lens version of that. I'd be very curious in your states, as you work through these processes, what things did you pull out of that? How do those intersect these other plans as you're working through? If Carrie in the chat will permit me to moderate her question just a little bit.
Yeah, so our energy security task force was our state energy planning effort. And so, as Curtis mentioned, it's a living document. And I think there's opportunities after this legislative session to start looking at other things that weren't in the initial phase of this energy planning effort, such as cybersecurity. South Central Alaska generates the majority of electricity with gas, natural gas, and we have a potential natural gas shortage coming in several years. And so I think it's a great start to a holistic approach. It's difficult to, some of these task force, it was a working task force, as Kurt has mentioned, 150 hours of meetings. That's just the meetings. There's so much behind the scenes work that takes place in addition to doing your normal job. And, pulling CEOs from different utilities, CEOs of native corporations, members of the legislature, it's really difficult to get all of it done in one session. And so I really think there's opportunity for other components to be integrated in the next phase of this planning effort.
Yeah, so I think, John's point, I'd echo that point in that things like energy efficiency and sort of renewable energy task forces, being able to sort of segment out topical focus areas allows us to sort of take a deeper dive with a smaller subset, and then be able to come back falling under the umbrella of the broader energy plan. I mean, we've got the EV infrastructure plan that will tie back into, we've got our climate action plan that will tie back into. So I think that's what it lends itself to, being able to, having your broader umbrella of your energy plan, but being able to have these subsets that you'll reference in that broader plan and be able to tap those for guidance for the overall objective. So breaking out the smaller topical areas is definitely valuable. It also allows for the opportunity to hear from folks that might be more siloed than others in the state, and that are outside of state government in ways that you might not otherwise get a chance to. And certainly it's allowed us, I guess, to tap in some cases certain centers of excellence at our university level or at our higher education level, which tends to be helpful as well. So I think being able to just have those topics broken out allows the chance to just take a deeper dive. I think too that in terms of the timing of plans and sort of the cycles of planning, I think that's also helpful and certainly allows reaction for what's triggered at the federal level and sort of around the region. So we've got our climate action plan, which is on a sort of 5-year cycle. Our energy plan will be on a 5-year cycle, but then we've got built in to our statute the sort of update implementation status reporting cycles as well. So being able to have a timeline that sort of you dictate your benchmarks is also helpful. So not just having the plan, but being able to sort of get back in the plan and make sure you're having updates and sort of being able to peel things out of it. I think that's got to go hand in hand as well.
Yeah, similar answer in New Jersey. And we love when the legislature puts in a iterative process into these planning processes. What we consider our energy master plan to be the foundational document for New Jersey clean energy policy, but there's a lot of priorities that we've been evaluating concurrently with implementing the energy master plan. For example, a lot of outstanding questions on what rate reform looks like. What does the future of the natural gas utility proceeding in New Jersey, what do those outcomes look like? How are we going to meet our 11 gigawatts by 2040 offshore wind procurement goal? Are we going to go beyond that procurement goal? All of these things that are happening on the sideline, not on the sidelines, but separate and apart from what the energy master plan is pulling together, is something that we are thinking about braiding. And like Nico was referencing, it is a timing exercise to some extent, and making sure that you are aligning on modeling inputs so that they match across all of these reports in that year, right? Similar with our New Jersey Council on the Green Economy workforce report, and how that can inform how policy will be achieved. So a couple of different things going. I think the one learned lesson from the 2019 EMP that we are trying to employ in our 2024 update is leveraging some of the work that's been done at individual stakeholder sessions and using that to, more actively engage and not duplicate efforts with our energy master plan update. So for example, if we are working through a stakeholder process on our clean building working group report, we might not, want to reconsider asking those same questions to the same audience when we do the energy master plan. Same with RGGI strategic funding plans, for example. So we're keeping that in mind.
I guess from Alaska's perspective, the one thing I would say is when you were doing your energy planning, diversity is key. I have to admit, when I first walked into our first meeting and looked around the room, it kind of reminded me of the bar scene out of Star Wars, going, how are we going to work together when the music stopped? But really, we had 20 individuals, 5 ex officio, but with that, we had legislators there. We had the chair of the Regulatory Commission of Alaska in the room. We had a mining company, as well as the local utilities and IPP. We had commissioners of DNR, or Division of Natural Resources, Department of Economic Conservation, hydro plan developer. But we had a good mixture. And at the end of the day, we all learned from each other. And I would probably say I walked in with some biases, and I walked out with a lot more better understanding of where somebody is coming from or why they believe in which they do. And we did have contentious part of our meetings where we didn't always agree, and we had some votes of the 15 voting members that were 7-8. But we learned from that, and we really reduced those. And so when we walked out, we all shook hands. We all had a great process. We thought it was a great, like I said, we didn't always get what we wanted, but it was a clear understanding because of the diversity of the group. And now having legislators, 2 of them that were ex officio members in Juneau now, they can help say, well, this is what the task force did. This is what so-and-so said. This is how we got to this. This is why this recommendation is so important. And we wouldn't have had that unless we had included them in part of the discussions. And so they all have ownership in it. And so with that, it's really the diversity of, don't be scared when you put somebody on there that you wonder, how's this person going to work out? That's probably the person you're going to learn the most from.
And Chris, before you dive into your next question, I don't think I answered Carrie's question. I think Carrie was asking specifically about the state energy security plan. If that's the IIJA plan, that was actually done with the help of AEA.
Yep.
Maybe Curtis can speak to any of those elements being incorporated into the work of the task force.
Thank you for that, John. Yeah, we were actually running 2 simultaneous projects. We both had them named. The governor came out and named it as the Alaska Energy Task Force, which is ironically what we started naming the security plan. So that became the profile, and so we were running that simultaneously. But that was included in part of it because it was helped understanding the diversity we had in Alaska. And when John had mentioned, we have communities that either their fuel comes in on barge or it gets flown in at $17 a gallon. And so those are some of the challenges we have in rural Alaska. And really, when we were meeting as the task force, a lot of that information was very helpful. So people understood when we had a representative from one of the rural native corporations talk about the challenges he had. And then we had a profile, as we called it, that was there to back it up and be available to kind of use as a research document. And I would say hats off to the AEA team, is because I know that document was one of the early ones and met all the points, and the governor signed off on it very early, submitting it to DOE. And so that helped be the foundation for some of the task force work as far as knowing the energy dependence issue.
So if I could jump in here with a question for the group, kind of going back to your stakeholder composition of the group for your task force, and this is for the entire group. when you look at some of the statutes and the executive orders that establish these plans, it really ends up, some of them can end up being very prescriptive in terms of a thou shalt include X person from X agency on your steering board. And then others are, a little bit more flexible when it comes to who is able to participate on some of these committees, kind of leaving it to the discretion of, say, the chief energy officer in the governor's office or the state energy office director. So what do you, from your state's perspective and how you're doing this, what do you kind of see as the trade-offs between those two approaches, and how is that either, kind of worked or not worked for you in terms of getting the right folks in the room to really kind of advance a planning effort forward once you start the process?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That was challenging. There was a lot of meetings between Curtis and the representative from the university prior to the release of the administrative order, trying to capture every piece of Alaska. And how do you do that with a state as big as we are? We did our best to incorporate a voice from as many sectors as we possibly could. I think having the legislature involved in the process was extremely helpful because they do represent the people of Alaska. Having the university involved, Alaska is unique in that we have a Department of Energy office dedicated to the Arctic. And so we involve the DOE's Arctic Energy Office. It is challenging, and we initially got some pushback with the size of the task force, but being able to represent as many stakeholders as possible is why our task force had 15 voting members and 5 ex officios.
One thing I'd like to mention with our task force, which I would hope that all the task force would do it. When the task force members were selected, they were 100% engaged. We did not, they didn't have secondary people within their organization attending. We had the chairman of the RCA attending. We had the chancellor of the university attending and chairing a subcommittee meeting. And so when we were meeting, we did have the attention, and that was one of the things that we worked with John, and that is, how do we make sure that everybody stays engaged and you don't have drop off? And with that, so when you select your task force members, that's really key that they are willing. And when task force members said, we want to meet on a Friday for 8 hours, we scheduled it. We made sure it worked for schedules, but very rarely, even the lieutenant governor, as busy as she was, I think she missed one meeting out of the 11. And so we did have 100% engagement. So when you're putting your task force together, don't be scared to require them to be there. Because everybody had busy schedules. Like I said, we had CEOs, lieutenant governor, chancellor university. They all attended all those meetings. They kind of had peer pressure to attend the meetings.
In New Jersey, in our executive order, we designated a leader to convene. And I think that was kind of the linchpin in making this a successful effort, because without deputizing a domain expert, it would be hard to wrangle a couple of folks to ensure that we have a whole of government approach when writing a statewide energy plan. So the executive order designated the president of our Board of Public Utilities to drive the Energy Master Plan committee, in which the executive order also designated like 7 core agencies who would delve deep into the Energy Master Plan. And I'm confident that they also roped in a couple supporting agencies to make sure we had that whole of government picture, at least internally with stakeholdering. Externally, we tried to pay careful attention to ensure that the stakeholders we're talking to are not inappropriately representing like other stakeholders that are a part of their coalitions, because a number of stakeholders we talk, for example, the environmental advocates, industry, faith leaders that are interested, environmental justice advocates that are interested, like none of those groups are a monolith. So it was important for us to reach very specific entities when doing a lot of the stakeholdering, which turned out to be a bigger lift than capacity allowed for, but it was something that we couldn't compromise.
In Delaware, we had a bit of a combination where in some ways the statute was very prescriptive in the appointments by position. And then in other ways, there were some some open-ended flexibilities where we identified the chair of the advisory council, and then that chairperson was able to then determine who the chairs of each of the working groups would be. So allowing some flexibility there. And I think to Curtis's point, being able to ensure that while you're appointing members to these working groups and to any, task forces and councils, that they are going to be engaged. And especially if you are sort of driven by statute and you do have sort of a timeline to follow, and needing things to align with legislative session. That's really important. I think we were at an advantage because we had the Governor's Energy Advisory Council before, and they had helped to craft our previous, most recent energy plan. So we were able to rely on some of those members that had participated before, which was actually very helpful for a lot of ways, including being able to bring information and lessons learned and experiences from before to the most recent group. So we had a combination, but I think being able to, I think also in some ways we know who the key players are in the sector, so we feel confident about being able to make sure the key players are at the table, I guess in terms of their organization being represented, but being able to sift through who is best to serve on the council and make the commitment, I guess is takes some doing to some extent. But I will say, I think in some ways our initial sort of run at that list of who should be members of the council, there were a few folks that we overlooked. And I think that's why it was important and helpful to have that. We were able to incorporate an open-ended aspect of the sort of recruitment process where we did allow a period of time for other folks out there in the ether, please contact us should you have interest or availability to participate. So we did allow for that mechanism too, to get at some folks that we may have overlooked. So that was helpful.
Thank you all. We're getting towards the end of the session today. I think just as a good bring us home question, as we've talked about, these are complicated, labor-intensive lifts. There's a lot of lessons learned along the way, things that come out that maybe you didn't expect. So I'd be very curious, knowing what you know now, if you had to go back and start this process again, or for the next time the process iterates, what would you carry forward, or what advice would you give your successors if they come asking in a few years on why and how we did this? And I'll just throw it out to the full panel.
I could take that one. So we are closer than some others might be on passing the baton. So we're ending our administration, and we're, it's at the forefront of our minds thinking about what a transition looks like and sort of setting up the next team, and continuity of the work and mechanisms to ensure that is in place. Are things that we're focusing on now. So, our last energy plan, we've got 5-year plan. So our last energy plan was from 2009 to 2014. And we're just now picking up a new energy plan. So not doing that again is what we're focused on. And so we're building in a couple of tools, building out certain digital platforms and making sure working group documentation can be stored in one place and accessed in one place. So really taking advantage of this time now. And building out those things. So that's what we're focused on in a lot of ways, but I think that continuity, so that and certainly with the energy environment, it's moving in a lot of ways. It's easy to fall behind, and we have the scars to prove what it feels like to fall behind. But I think to just make sure we don't do those things again, I think we're focused on continuity, and including during times when you have a clear out of the administration, you have a clear out of the cabinet, and you can't necessarily rely on the people, but the work that they did, being able to have that documented, be able to have the process documented. And I think our sort of series of legislation over the past couple of years has allowed us to lay out processes so that we can sort of go back and know where we were even though there's going to be turnover in the people. So I would lend that as one really big lesson learned, that hopefully folks can just focus on what the continuity plan is going to be.
I think for our next iteration in this 2024 Energy Master Plan exercise we're undertaking is to pay careful attention, especially to the costs of implementation, or at the very least, like being very transparent about that, doing early stakeholdering on that matter. What we did with the 2019 EMP was release almost what I consider to be an addendum in the form of a ratepayer impact study of all of the policies in the 2019 Energy Master Plan. It was something that we got really critiqued on, first and foremost, because it looked at bill impacts and less so some of the capital cost impacts to the state. So that's something we're paying extra careful attention to. I think there's a couple other like barriers in terms of like external politics, having other competing priorities, or at the very least, like multiple priorities that need to be juggled while this exercise is being undertaken. So make sure you designate a core team to make sure the work continues. We have a great consultant on board, so we're excited about digging in. And we've also, out of the governor's office, has taken a leadership role on this energy master plan to make sure that the whole of government approach is not taken lightly, and that the governor's office is driving a significant amount of policies. There's also like numerous ecosystem updates that have occurred, especially when you talk about the costs of clean energy and how some of the forward-looking policies should be incorporating those considerations. So that's kind of like the big third thing that we are undertaking. I think the last thing, and I said this in bits and pieces already, but doing a lot of the stakeholdering up front is going to be very important for us. I mean, first and foremost, for like socialization of policy reasons, to get buy-in from a lot of different groups, but also to make sure that we're not missing anything, and to hear the upfront grievances from a lot of groups on what we left out of the 2019 Energy Master Plan and what they would like to see in this one. So definitely doing some more on the ground stakeholdering with this plan.
Yeah, I think from Alaska's perspective, I know Governor Dunleavy, he has a couple more years in office, but clearly, like he said, it's a living document. So we'll probably revisit this after our legislative session is over. We do have we all know we have an election in November, so there's going to be a different legislature to some degree here in Alaska. And I think by then we'll look at kind of moving forward of what worked and what needs to be pushed a little bit harder, and of those 60 recommendations and what actually has passed this legislative session, and then be able to be in a position to hand this off to the next governor in a couple of years, where it's already been through 2 revisions or a second revision. And I'll refer to John. He's in a different role than he was before, but I think that was the goal. But
yeah, my biggest recommendation would be, prior to starting the effort, identify all the resources needed to make this happen. The Alaska Energy Authority was so gracious by hosting all the meetings, providing lunches. There's real cost, a lot of staff time from the Energy Authority. They also put in a significant amount of funding, as well as the university, for the creation of the report. We had a moderator, and so there are real costs associated with these efforts. So well in advance, identify those costs and resources needed to bring these plans to fruition.
Sure. Thank you all for the great insight and practices for comprehensive statewide energy planning. That brings us right to the end of the session. Really appreciate all of you taking the time to chat with us. And just a reminder to everyone on the call that we'll have 5 more of these calls each month through the end of the summer. We'll explore different topics as we go. And so picking up a thread that a lot of you touched on was these structures of governance, and how you structure accountability and start to engage the broader energy sector will be the topic of our next conversation on May 23rd, also at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We appreciate your time, and thank you again to the panelists for sharing your expertise. Appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.